The history of student activism and protests on college campuses is a rich and dynamic narrative that spans many decades. Students have been at the forefront of social and political movements, advocating for civil rights, peace, environmental conservation, gender equality, and various other causes. The evolution of student activism reflects the changing social and political landscapes of different eras. Here is an overview of key moments in the history of student activism. 1. Early 20th century. Anti-war protests. In the early 20th century, students were involved in anti-war protests, particularly during World War I. Some students opposed the war, leading to campus demonstrations and activism. Civil rights movement. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, college students played a crucial role in advocating for racial equality. They participated in sit-ins, marches, and other actions to challenge segregation and discrimination. 2. Free speech movement, 1960s. University of California, Berkeley. In the 1960s, Berkeley became a focal point for the free speech movement. Students protested against restrictions on political activities on campus, advocating for the right to express their political views. 3. Vietnam War era, 1960s–1970s. Anti-Vietnam War protests. College campuses were hotbeds of anti-Vietnam War activism. Students organized protests, strikes, and campus takeovers to express their opposition to the war. The Kent State University shooting in 1970, where National Guardsmen killed 4 students during an anti-war protest, remains a tragic symbol of this era. Women's liberation. The late 1960s and early 1970s also saw the rise of the women's liberation movement. Students protested against gender inequality, calling for women's rights, reproductive rights, and an end to discrimination. 4. Environmental activism, 1970s. Earth Day protests. The first Earth Day in 1970 saw widespread student participation in environmental protests and events. This marked the beginning of a growing environmental movement on college campuses. 5. Anti-apartheid movement, 1980s. Divestment campaigns. Students advocated for the divestment of university funds from companies doing business in apartheid-era South Africa. This movement contributed to increased international pressure on the apartheid regime. 6. LGBTQ+ rights activism, 1980s present. AIDS activism. During the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, students were involved in activism to raise awareness, advocate for research funding, and challenge stigmatization. LGBTQ+ rights. LGBTQ+ students and allies have been involved in activism for equal rights, anti-discrimination policies, and broader societal acceptance. This activism continues to evolve and gain momentum. 7. Global justice and anti-globalization protests, 1990s–2000s. Anti-globalization protests. Students were active participants in protests against globalization, particularly at international summits. Issues such as economic inequality, labor rights, and environmental concerns were central to these demonstrations. 8. Occupy movement, 2011. Occupy Wall Street. The Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011 brought attention to economic inequality. Students and young activists were key participants, expressing discontent with the financial system and corporate influence in politics. 9. Black Lives Matter movement, 2010s present. Racial justice protests. In response to instances of police brutality and systemic racism, students have been actively involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. Campus activism has focused on racial justice, diversity, and inclusion. 10. Gun control activism, 2010s present. March for Our Lives. Students who survived the Parkland school shooting in 2018 led the March for Our Lives movement, advocating for stricter gun control laws and increased school safety measures. Challenges and impact. Repression and backlash. Student activists have often faced repression, disciplinary actions, and backlash from authorities. However, their actions have led to tangible changes in policies, societal attitudes, and institutional practices. Legacy and inspiration. The history of student activism serves as a source of inspiration for future generations. Many of the movements led by students have left a lasting legacy and have influenced broader social and political change. Student activism continues to evolve, responding to contemporary challenges and championing social justice causes. The history of these movements demonstrates the enduring power of students to drive societal change and advocate for a more just and equitable world.